Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and today we tackle the first two focus points on the chapter, How Secure Was the USSR's Control Over Eastern Europe, 1948 to 1989. And of course, the focus of these two points is Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Now, in our introductory video, one of the things that we discussed in order to set up a story is that following the Second World War, the Soviet Union created an Iron Curtain, or that's what Mr. Winston Churchill called it, in order to protect itself from future attacks and also have a means to provide it with raw materials. Countries that fell to the east of this Iron Curtain included Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and several others. But this is what we will be focusing on in this particular chapter. For our focus points, number 1 and number 2, we are going to look at Hungary and the incidents that occur in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. These two incidents have a lot in common with each other, although the differences are also noteworthy, and we'll talk about that, of course. So here are the focus points, and as I mentioned, this video bundles together the first two because they go so well together. Hungary and Czechoslovakia, 1956, 1968, and looking at the similarities and the differences of these two. As we look at Hungary, to start with, I'm going to suggest that we think about the events through a matrix. And that matrix includes what were the causes for the uprisings, what was the Soviet reaction, and what was the world reaction. Now, when we look at Hungary, one of the things that you may remember is that Hungary fights with Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And at the end of the war, essentially the Soviets move in and take over control of Eastern Europe. As we look at the events in 1956 and the causes, one of the things that I like to point out is that the Soviets had a great deal of influence on who the leaders in Hungary would be, and they were very influential in the elections that were being held. The other aspect is that the Soviets helped to run secret police organizations in Hungary in order to keep an eye on who were the people who were spreading rumors and trying to cause uprisings. Finally, one of the things that is very important is that the economy, and specifically the farming and the dairy and wheat and all those kinds of things, these were resources that were stretched to its limits because many of the resources were leaving Hungary and going to the Soviet Union. So in 1956, the uprising begins, and it was started mainly in the streets in which there were students that were trying to bring about change and reform. One of the things that occurs is that the Soviet Union steps in and essentially says there needs to be new leadership. And the new leadership was under a man by the name of Nagy. It's spelled Nagy, but I believe in Hungarian it would be pronounced Nagy. So please note that in your book. And essentially what this individual believed is that they could work with the Soviets in order to bring about some reforms. This had happened in Poland a few years before, and essentially Hungarians were hungry for reform, they were hungry for change, and they believed that it was possible. Tensions go back and forth, but finally this new prime minister and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, essentially come to an agreement. Well, the prime minister essentially starts promising too much, and essentially they say Hungary is going to leave the Warsaw Pact, which is the sphere of influence that the Soviet Union has created, and is going to break free. And the reaction of the Soviets is that they send in the troops, they send in the tanks. And this all culminates in November of 1956 when warfare breaks out on the streets in Hungary specifically in the capital of Budapest, in which Hungarians are fighting tanks hand to hand, running up to these large vehicles, throwing grenades into the tanks. But obviously, people on foot are no match for armored vehicles, and essentially the Hungarian uprisers are put down. Leaders such as members of the Catholic Church in Hungary, like Cardinal Medinsky, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce Hungarian names very well, and the Prime Minister are essentially rounded up, they're imprisoned, and they would be executed after this time period. And in the end, over 1,000 Hungarians would be killed. Now, what was the world reaction to these events? First, there were lots of leaders in the West that would say, oh, we are praying for the Hungarians. But the United Nations, which was the world organization set up to essentially look after these affairs after World War II, they do nothing. So the Hungarian people essentially slipped back into Soviet control, and the Soviets continued to control Hungary for the next 40 years. In Czechoslovakia, more than 10 years later, something very similar happens. This time period is often referred to as the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was a series of reforms that were taking place in the Czechoslovakia country, in which people were beginning to see more freedoms take place. Once again, let's take a look at it through our rubric of what were the causes, what was the Soviet reaction, and what was the world reaction. Now, some of the reforms that I talked about in the Prague Spring included an increased freedom of speech. Individuals were able to openly criticize the government. There was larger newspaper circulation in which there was a larger free press. And when these freedoms start to bubble to the surface, it inspires the people of Czechoslovakia to speak out and recognize that life could be better if it were not a part of the Soviet sphere of influence. One of the other things which happens is that there's a great deal of reform, specifically for farmers and also for workers. There's also a very interesting discussion taking place in which they start talking about how Czechoslovakia, which was formed at the end of the First World War, bringing together Czech people and Slovak people, perhaps should be broken apart, and that Czech people should have its own country and Slovak people have their own country. So this is the backdrop of what is happening in Czechoslovakia in 1968. What is the Soviet reaction to this? Well, first of all, they send in the troops once again. One of the things that is fortunate is, unlike what happens in Hungary, this is a protest which the people do not fight back in large numbers. There are a few deaths, there are a few martyrs. Specifically, our textbook helps to illustrate that. But the people in Czechoslovakia realize the futility of fighting back in that manner. But one of the important things that happens because of the Prague Spring in 1968 is that the new Soviet premier, Brezhnev, he essentially comes up with what is known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. And essentially it has two parts. The first is that it says that there will only be one party in each of these nations. So this will help to cut down on voices of dissent. And then second, any country which is a part of the Warsaw Pact has to stay in the Warsaw Pact. There's no leaving. So the Soviets are very strong in 1968 to reinforce their position as the overseer of Eastern Europe. The world reaction, once again, is one in which leaders of the time will speak up against the Soviet Union. They will talk about how this is a terrible thing. But the United Nations What do? Essentially nothing. Now, I think that our book does a very nice job, and if you look on page 122, there's a very nice table which breaks into different topics. What are the similarities and what are the differences between what happens in Hungary and what happens in Czechoslovakia? But what I would recommend, just as an overview, is try to think about it once again through our rubric. We have causes. One of the big differences in the causes of these two is internal versus external. In Czechoslovakia, most of the reforms that are taking place that bubble to the surface are driven internally by the Czech people, while if you look at Hungary, many of the things that inspire the Hungarians are happening outside of Hungary, and they believe that these changes can also happen for them. When we look at the Soviet reaction, the most obvious difference is that in Hungary it was far more violent, while in Czechoslovakia it was some violence, but it was far more peaceful. And if we look at the world reaction, in some ways, from the Western perspective, is the same, but from other Soviet nations and those spheres of influence, in Hungary, the first time, essentially it's accepted that essentially Eastern nations believed that, well, Hungary was kind of getting what it deserved. However, in Czechoslovakia, other Eastern nations specifically kind of stepped up and started to wonder, is this really the kind of world that we want to live in? And specifically, if you look at what was happening in Romania, another Eastern country, they begin to actually complain about how the Soviets are treating their neighbors in Czechoslovakia. When thinking about these topics, try to include key vocabulary words which help to make your essay stronger. Here's a short list of the main ideas that I'd like you to include for Hungary. We have the Prime Minister, Naj, Cardinal Medinsky. I'm sorry, I really apologize. I cannot speak Hungarian. We have Warsaw Pact, of course, and Nikita Khrushchev. For Czechoslovakia, try to use the key vocabulary words including Prague Spring, Alexander Dubek, who is the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia at the time, the Brezhnev Doctrine, and the KGB, the secret police. All right, guys. So that's the first two focus points for this chapter, and I look forward to discussing more in class over the next few weeks.